What's up? I'm Lore from TankSpot and welcome back to the Starcraft 2 Beta Journal. Finally, after several delays, I am very excited to be able to bring you guys our Terran units preview. Terrans have probably the most diverse and complex units of the three races in Starcraft 2, so it's going to be a lot of fun showing them to you guys. Let's get started. When I think Terran, I think Marines, and they're back and just as solid as ever. Terran is still the only race to get a ranged unit immediately at Tier 1, and although StarCraft 2 does bring some new options in terms of infantry, the Marines' flexibility makes them the bread and butter unit of the Terran ground army. Upgraded with stim packs and the new combat shield health increase, they can be quite powerful on their own. Of course, no self-respecting Marine goes out into the field without a medic handy, which is where the medevac comes into play. These are pretty much a straight combination of the dropship and the medic, serving as air transport and healing nearby biological units. Of course, it's important to remember if you're, say, a Zerg trying to do some early Overlord scouting, that Marines, those Marines, they can shoot up, and yeah, whoops. Next up is the Reaper. These are some particularly nasty guys with particularly nasty pistols that can pull off some particularly nasty harassment in the early game. They've got jetpacks, which lets them hop over cliffs and thus bypass any sort of defenses an opponent might have, and they do a pretty substantial amount of damage with their attacks. They also move incredibly fast, and their speed can even be upgraded, which makes it pretty easy to kite enemy melee units and slowly whittle them down. Fortunately for the rest of the universe, their range is pretty short, so as soon as the enemy gets any sort of ranged unit nearby, they get shut down pretty quickly. But if the Terran can get even just one or two out fast enough, they can still do a ton of damage to their opponent's economy before that happens. Now let's look at the Marauder. These guys are heavily armored and can take quite a beating, plus they do a pretty hefty amount of damage, especially to other armored units. They can also be upgraded with concussive grenades, which give their attacks a slowing effect, which again means these poor zealots just can't get in range. They can also use stim packs just like Marines, which makes them very popular for early straight-up aggression at an enemy's front door. Ghosts are back as well, although their kit has changed quite a bit. They're still able to cloak, but they've also picked up the ability to let off an EMP blast, which drains enemy shields and energy in a certain radius. Beautiful for softening up a Protoss force before you move in with your army. They can also snipe biological targets, which does a pretty large amount of damage and completely ignores armor, making it fairly potent against Zerg. And of course, they still have their most important ability from the original StarCraft, the ability to call down a tactical nuclear strike. Now, while bullets will stop a Zergling fine under most circumstances, sometimes Marines just aren't enough. That's where Hellions come in. These guys absolutely roast light units, if you can see what I mean. Not only do their flamethrowers have a hefty bonus against light units like Zerglings, they can hit more than one target at a time and can even be upgraded to have an even bigger bonus against light units. They also move very quickly, which makes them surprisingly versatile in the early stages of the game. And where would Terrans be without siege tanks? In siege mode, these guys are just like they were in the original, dealing massive amounts of damage at ridiculous range. StarCraft 2 brings them a very interesting boost to their normal tank mode, however, giving them a sizable bonus against armored units when unsieged and a much faster firing rate. This makes them incredibly versatile against a ground army. And then there was Thor. These enormous walkers serve two purposes. Against air units, they have a very long-range missile attack that can not only put some serious hurt on light units, but will also deal splash damage, which makes them pretty much custom-made to deal with Mutalisks. They're not half bad on the ground either. Against the right units, just one Thor can hold his own for quite a while. Notice how his size actually gives him a real solid advantage here. Multiple SCVs can all be repairing one Thor at the same time, forcing the enemy to choose between either spending time killing off the SCVs while the Thor eats through their units, or trying to burn down the Thor while the SCVs repair it. Now let's take a look at the Viking. In their air mode, they're very strong air-to-air combatants, particularly against armored units. The Viking has a twist, however. He's able to land and transform into a ground unit, and although he's not the strongest of the Terran's ground forces, this makes him yet another incredibly versatile addition to the Terran army. Notice how these Vikings can land, take out this queen, then take off again to kill off some overlords. This sort of harassment can be very effective when done carefully. The next member of the Terran Air Force is the Banshee. They're very strong air-to-ground fighters, capable of putting some pretty obnoxious pressure on an enemy player. Not only do they simply just do a lot of damage, they can also be upgraded with Cloak. They're a little fragile, but the amount of damage just a couple of Banshees can get away with is tremendous. Next up, let's look at the Raven. They have no direct attack, but they're able to throw a handful of gadgets around that make them more than worth their while. This is the Hunter-Seeker missile. It chases down a targeted enemy unit until it reaches them, at which point it explodes for a very large amount of damage to anything nearby. They're also able to summon auto turrets, and although they don't do a ton of damage up front, they last a long time and can be seriously obnoxious when placed in the right spots. They're also able to deploy point defense drones, which are able to intercept certain ranged attacks, stopping them from ever dealing damage. Ravens also serve as the Terran's mobile detector unit, revealing hidden enemies nearby. The last unit we'll take a look at is the Battle Cruiser. These guys are every bit the floating platform of death they were in the original, and ultimately not too much has changed about them. They're still strong against both air and ground units, they're still pretty tough to kill, and they're still incredibly expensive to produce. And yes, they still can be upgraded with the Yamato cannon, which costs a ton of energy to use, but deals a ton of damage as well. Now before I wrap this up, there's one very important thing to note about the Terran army. More than any other race, Terran players are rewarded for having a diverse build with several different units working together. A combination of Marines and Marauders using Stim, while Medevacs heal them and Ravens drop point defense drones with maybe a couple tanks or Thors thrown in for good measure, can be significantly stronger than simply massing up a ton of Marines. That sort of diversity and versatility is what makes Terran really fun to play. Anyway, thanks for watching, I'm Lore, and I'll see you later.